Alright, so as I said in the blog, I kind of want to give you a little bit of a visual representation of schemas so that everyone kind of understands a little bit better because it's kind of a complex topic. But once you kind of see it in action, it's a lot simpler. Alright, so here's a visual representation of a schema. I kind of just threw this together in beautiful Microsoft Word. But as you can see, there is a central idea. That's kind of what you're thinking about and what activates the rest of the ideas in the schema. In this particular situation, I just picked professors because it's easy to think of things that might branch off from there. Obviously, this is an incomplete schema because there are a lot more associations going on. But you can kind of see how in the middle you have the main term, and as you branch out, you get other things that might describe a professor. So you might think of them as well educated in one of the branches. One of the other branches might be their age or their background, things like that will just give you kind of a representation of professors in your mind. So with this representation, we're seeing spreading activation. The blue circles are concepts that have been activated in your mind. And so from that original slide, a few more are activated kind of as they go out, and they're spreading out into further associations in the lower representation here. Kind of the idea is as you light up certain ideas in your mind, more of them spread out until eventually basically everything is activated. Do note though that at the bottom there I have a few that are not activated, and that's kind of the idea that sometimes there are things that are within our schema that we just don't think about because they never really come up. Such as in this case with the professors, maybe we don't really think at all about what other career choices they might have wanted to select. You know, that would be part of their character, but at this time it's not really activated, maybe because you're not talking about it, or because it just doesn't cross your mind. So sometimes your entire schema doesn't activate. But for the most part, the spreading activation works in a very outbranching motion. So now I'm going to start getting into the idea of how these schemas actually interact with real representations in life. So on the left we have that schema that we already constructed about professors. On the right I have kind of the real schema, what the professor actually fits in a situation where maybe you're just talking to a new professor and you don't know much about them. So as you can see, some of the things are correct. You know, we have same branching off in a couple areas that our schema is correct, and yet at the same time there are some areas where it's completely different. Things that are different outcroppings. There are just things we wouldn't expect because we don't think about them as a schema. And so this is where we start getting into stereotyping, because when we don't see the other parts of the schema that aren't represented within our mind, we sometimes put them kind of behind us and we don't really think about it. And so at that point we can start getting stereotypes. And so what our mind does then is it's going to overlap our schema with the real schema, or what the professor really represents. So here we have the overlap of the two schemas. As you can see, I just went ahead and put the orange ones over top of the blue ones. So in a lot of cases, they're just fine. You know, they match perfectly. But then you see some of the blue ones and even the non-activated black parts of the schema that are kind of peeking out or are showing up to be different. And in those situations, we'll actually still interpret our schema as the one that's being correct. Basically, the only way our schema can be changed is if we have repeated exposure to something that breaks our own schema, or if we really think about it. And that's the problem, as I discussed with limited capacity in the blog post. We don't ever have the cognitive ability or cognitive space to think about these things at all times. And schemas basically save you mental energy by focusing things and giving them meaning without us having to think about them every time. In other words, if you see a professor on your first day of class, you can kind of have an idea of what they're going to be like. You don't have to think about it individually for each one, because that would take a lot of cognitive energy. So the schemas, they save your cognitive energy for your mind, but at the same time they can also create these stereotypes. And we're going to see how how it's changed, because schemas are not changed very easily. So here's kind of the equation of schemas I like to use here. And so we take our original schema plus the reality schema, and when we overlap them, you kind of saw how they were different. And in the end, we get a resulting schema with minimal change at the bottom there. And as you can see, a few of the angles are changed a little bit, but in general, it more represents our old schema. Very few times does it occur that we completely change our own schema from one representation. However, if that orange representation came up over and over and over again, the changes would gradually get closer and closer to that point. Another thing to notice is that in the bottom right of our new schema, we've actually dropped one of the portions of the old schema. And that could have been because your real representation did not have it, and you haven't actually come upon a representation with it. So over time, maybe we dropped that part of our schema. This is a pretty basic example of how they work and how they change, but I just wanted to give you more of a visual idea instead of just writing in the blog. And then I went ahead and did a little project. So I was interested to see how people could create their own schemas about an individual picture or kind of an individual representation of someone. So I went and found a picture. This is of an Iraqi refugee who is returning back to his home basically after all the violence finally stopped. And I went ahead and put this picture up on one of those picture rating websites. I don't know if you've ever been there, but what happens is basically the people take a look at the picture, and the first word that pops into their mind, they go ahead and write that down, and then you get to see, you as the person who posted the pic get to see the results. Most people do it kind of as a self-image thing. I did it more as a social experiment with this representation of the man with his child here, and kind of see what kind of comments I got. I gathered the first 50 because I wasn't sure how many I would get, and so I thought 50 was a good number, and there were some interesting results. These are about 10 of the results. Basically, some things I saw that were pretty encouraging about what people thought about this picture. You see you get an idea of him as a working man, he's trying to help his family and, is a good father, caring. These, very positive image ideas of this picture, and that's very encouraging. Unfortunately, it only made up about 11 of the 50 responses. The other 39 ended up like something more down there. So these are kind of the idea of the lazy, stupid, destitute man who at times is now being called a terrorist. And sadly, the term terrorist was the #1 response I received, with 7 people commenting that they thought he was a terrorist. And to me, that falls upon stereotypes, but it's also part of a schema. If you basically made lines from the middle of that picture to all these terms, that would create a schema. And so if the people at the bottom are creating their schema with anyone who looks like this as a terrorist, it's going to be really hard to change their perception to the hardworking good father, because they would need representation after representation. And unfortunately, most people aren't going to come across a lot of great examples simply because we don't live in that part of the world. And so most of the examples we get is from media. And those media examples tend to be about terrorists, or about, bad things that are happening, because the media talks about, individualistic events that are often negative events. And so that's all they can associate these poor people with. Even though this man is nothing more than a refugee, he's being seen as a terrorist simply because of his nationality. And so that's where schemas can really get into trouble with stereotyping and creating silence, i.e. the spiral of silence, which is the overview of the blog. So I just kind of wanted to give you guys that little experiment I did, and it is a little concerning, but not all that surprising if you ask me. So that's the end, and like I said, I just wanted to give you a visual representation. I also want to thank my COM 470 professor, Rick Bissell. He kind of gave me the idea of giving it a visual representation. He was also the one who, he lectured on schemas, so schema theory, I'll give the credit to him for coming up with a lot of this. So thank you to him, and thank you guys for watching.